Thank you, Arifili, for inviting us here to talk about these beautiful films. And thank you for my fellow panelists to be here tonight. I think each of us is gonna talk very briefly about the films that we have seen. And just to contextualize them, explain maybe a little bit what we've seen. And then we're gonna have a chat amongst ourselves and open it up to you guys.
So I think we're starting with the Seashell and the Clergyman, doing it in historical order. So it was directed by Germaine Dulac in 1928, but it was directed from a script by the writer and actor Antonin Artaud, who was part of the Surrealist movement at that time. So he had written a script and he asked Germaine Dulac to direct it. And Dulac was a seasoned filmmaker at that point. She was a fairly established figure already by that point. She had been directing since 1915 for the production company that she ran and had started with her husband and her lover and business partner, Irène Hillel Erlanger. And in 1922, she had made The Smiling Madame Bedet, about the fantasies of an unhappily married woman, and this is possibly one of her most famous and most praised films now. Dulac wasn't a surrealist. She was associated with impressionist cinema, with people like Jean Epstein, Abel Gance, Jean Renoir, Marcel L'Herbier. And their aim was to move away from literature and theatre, from narrative, verbal forms of cinema, and to aim for a visual form of expression that would be more like music. And she was also associated with pure cinema, with Dada artists such as René Clair and Man Ray. And their conception of cinema was also abstract and non-narrative, although they had a bit more of a humorous, satirical edge. So as Erifili mentioned, when the film was screened, it allegedly caused a riot with some surrealists shouting insults at the screen, although reports of the night based on witnesses' accounts are contradictory. For instance, it's not quite clear whether Artaud was there or not. So it's a bit difficult to know exactly what happened. But what was sure was that Artaud was not very happy with the result, with the film, at least initially, because he felt that she had tried to give meaning and coherence, and he wanted to defy all kinds of possible interpretations, including psychological ones. And one of the problems was possibly the notion of dream. So Dulac ended up making something that looked like a dream, and what Artaud wanted to make was something that felt like a dream. That was the experience of a dream, and that sort of connected the viewer with the workings of the mind, and he didn't feel that she had quite done that. The other potential reason for the surrealists not liking this film very much was Artaud, in his preface to the script, said that film must spring from a shock designed for the eyes, a shock founded on the very substance of the gaze. And for Artaud and for the surrealists, that element of shock, of aggression and violence was absolutely crucial to their conception of art. It was precisely through this violent assault on the senses that art in their minds could liberate spectators from conventional aesthetic, social and moral values. So instead, Dulac's film is elegant, it's poetic, it's lyrical, but it doesn't unsettle, provoke, or disturb spectators. It doesn't shock them into a different perception of art and life. You see this in the murder scene. It should be horrific and unsettling, and in fact, it's really quite visually interesting. So it doesn't quite have the effect, for instance, of the slicing of the eyeball in Un Chien Andalou, to give you an element of comparison. Despite his initial dissatisfaction with the film, however, Artaud later claimed that the Seashell and the Clergyman was the first surrealist film, and that Buñuel and Dali's Un chien andalou and Cocteau's The Blood of a Poet were derived from it. And it is now considered by many commentators as the first surrealist film.
Thank you. So, attention. Maya Deren does not want you to think of this film as surrealist. So in programme notes that she would hand out at screenings, very much like this, she was incredibly clear about this. Under no conditions are these films to be announced or publicised as surrealist or Freudian. This is not only a serious misrepresentation of the films, but also confuses the audiences by inspiring a false interpretation of the films according to systems to which they bear no relation. The preoccupation with conscious control of form, which is involved, is obviously at variance with the surrealist ethic of spontaneity. So that's the Guardian cinema programmers told. I jest. So although Deren didn't see her own films as surrealist, that is, she didn't see them as operating in the language of the irrational or the spontaneous, this wasn't shared by many critics of the time, who did compare the film to the 1920s surrealist cinema of Buñuel, Dali, Man Ray, and Jean Cocteau, and obviously of relevance to this programme, Germaine Dulac. One reviewer wrote that Seashell and the Clergyman might have sprung from the heart of an identical twin of Maya Deren. So in her excellent book, which I really recommend, Points of Resistance, Lauren Rabinowitz points out that at the time that Meshes was coming out, surrealist cinema was the main cinematic comparison point for films that were working with dream imagery, with logical disturbances, and with ideas and explorations of the subconscious. And she also suggests, and I think this point's really interesting, that Deren rejected the surrealist interpretation of the film because she was against the idea that the latent possibility, and I quote, that the latent possibility that such surrealist celebrations of irrational, subconscious spontaneity was feminine. It was a feminine notion. So instead she wanted to ground it in the language of science and the rational. In other words, the kind of, in a sense, the master language of patriarchy. So the fact that Deren rejects this surrealist framing, I think, is really interesting, in particularly when you think about the extensive interest that she had in trance, and particularly her later work on Haitian voodoo and possession. So this was like a very long running thread in her work. So this idea of trance and also somnambulism was an important framing device for how the film was written about, particularly by historian P. Adam Sidney in his important work, Visionary Film. And the book opens with this sustained, so the whole study opens with a sustained comparison between Meshes of the Afternoon and Un chien andalou. And though he kind of says that Meshes of the Afternoon isn't a surrealist film, he draws out a lot of shared points of comparison, including this kind of dreamlike structure, this dreamlike frame, the presence of doubles, which we actually see across all three films tonight, and this portrayal of a kind of latent or explicit violence. But also both were the products of collaborations. So Meshes of the Afternoon was produced, it was a collaboration between Deren and her then husband, the documentary filmmaker Alexander Hamid. So Sidney refers to Meshes as a trance film, and this was also building on what Parker Tyler was noticing at the time, another film critic, scholar, who an observation that an important trope in the avant-garde at this time was where films where the action is a dream and the actor a somnambulist. So having said all of that, I think there are really important resonances between Meshes of the Afternoon and surrealist cinema. We can talk about this later, but just very briefly, Deren mixed in surrealist circles when she moved to New York. So there was a lot of emigre artists and writers from the Parisian surrealist circle who moved to New York because of the occupation. And so she was engaging with these people. And then her later unfinished work, Witch's Cradle, it's an amazing film, you can find it online, was also a collaboration with surrealist artists, and and there was many ways. It was also engaging with Marcel Duchamp's exhibition. So there's sort of like, we can talk about this later, but very important kind of connections to surrealist work and ideas. So, having said all of this, there are also very strong points of overlap between the surrealist interest in dreams, interiority, the playful potential of play, ritual and magic in her later work, and surrealist. So these two worlds intersect in very potent ways. And just to end, I'm not sure I want to claim Deren as a kind of unrecognized member of the surrealist movement, but I am interested in thinking about what it is about surrealism that women artists like Deren, Hammer, Dulac and others either were engaging with or kind of found space to do interesting stuff in. So, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I am going to sort of expand on the genealogy that we're tracing here and move into the 1970s with Barbara Hammer. And we see here in her film Psychosynthesis different aspects of her personality that she's drawing on, and very much as the other films that we've talked about, she was inspired to make this film from a session with her therapist, who encouraged her to lie on the floor and sort of open the door in her mind. And there's a lot of doors in these films, actually, which we can talk about. And she saw these characters come out and chant, "I am one, I am whole." And to her, this signified a synthesis of all aspects of her identity. And she decided to acknowledge them in this film as an act of self-discovery, but also of self-love. And she created this film as part of her master's in film studies, and in the sort of written essay that she turned in along with the films, 4 of them in total. She wrote a very sort of second wave feminist line. She wrote that she wanted to make her female sensibility relevant and ripple into the political and the universal. And I think Psychosynthesis is surely a very personal, very autobiographical film, but it does demand a personal engagement from the audience, from us to be understood. And Hammer uses what she refers to as feeling imagery in it. So she has this idea that she wants to use imagery that conveys a very sort of gut-gripping level of feeling. And she's hoping that rather than logic, we will have to use our right brain thinking to make sense of it, which actually is where I see a strong connection with the surrealist movement and interests and aesthetics. This film is very rooted in the power of the unconscious, and it strives to free the imagination of the artist and of the audience by encouraging this game of sort of free associations. How much can we make out from it? And it's also quite clearly analyzing, exploring the structure of dreams, like the other films, perhaps. But for sure, time is not linear in this film either. It is emotionally sequential. And Hammer actually learned this idea from reading Deren's writings. She was quite fascinated with Maya Deren, and she particularly buys into this idea of time as simultaneous and a poetic experience. So the film is sort of built around this emotional core that, like a center of gravity, attracts all imagery to it. But what Hammer added to Deren's theory and poetics was obviously the addressing of the absence of lesbian representation, and she really focuses on representing women, relations among women of different kinds. And she is sort of including all women that are herself of different ages within this film. And when I was thinking of the legacy that she left us with this exploration of lesbian identity and sexuality, I was also quite taken by how in this film she's also exploring different ages. Hammer made a lot of films about aging, illness, and death. She wrote a lot about it. And she's sort of trying to include, I think, these inevitabilities of life into her art, which I thought was quite beautiful. But also I wanted to mention part of her legacy being establishing a grant for women and lesbian filmmakers to do their work and get paid for it. Because I think material and monetary barriers to filmmaking play a big part in the politics of underrepresentation, and maybe we can talk a little bit about that. I think women filmmakers being plagued by poverty, I think, has been sort of a trend through time. So Hammer, like Deren and Dulac, I think are all relatively well known within the experimental film canon, but obviously they are marginal filmmakers operating within a marginal artistic practice of experimental cinema. And their gender, their sexuality has influenced the way that they have been perceived and received, and how their films have been programmed, scheduled, and taught. So I sort of wanted to turn to my fellow panelists and ask what your perception was of how these films have been sort of partially perhaps obscured in the folds of cinema history, specifically surrealism, but I think quite generally as women filmmakers.
I'm not sure that the Seashell and the Clergyman has, to be honest. I mean, there was for a long time Un Chien Andalou considered the first surrealist film, and this may have something to do with the initial reaction to the film and Artaud's own dismissal of it. But then, as you can see, he quickly decided he liked the film, and it was actually the first surrealist film. So I think the Seashell and the Clergyman has been recognized, and now is being duly recognized as the first surrealist film, at least in my view. So I don't know if it had that much of a struggle. I think it was always a bit of a, surrealist, avant-garde kind of classic, really. And also you have to remember the position of women filmmakers at the time is quite interesting, because the early pioneering women directors, it was much easier for them to make films than, for instance, women in the 60s or 70s. So there was this amazing time when cinema was not seen as a proper art form by men, and therefore there was space for the women. So she had a career as a filmmaker, both as an avant-gardist and then as a more commercial filmmaker, director of newsreels as well. So I think she's perhaps in a slightly different kind of category.
Yeah, she was, oddly, I think it's odd in a way to think about going back in time as a time where women artists had more freedom or more agency, but it is, yeah, of course, absolutely true. What about meshes? What about Maya Deren?
Yeah, a sort of a similar thing, I think. So I think of meshes as like peak canon, but in the sense that, for many people it's their introduction to avant-garde film. It's taught widely on film courses. It's now number 20 or something on the Sight and Sound greatest films of all time list. And there are many ways in which, this is, an introduction for many to experimental film. And in terms of the idea of sort of early cinema being a moment for women filmmakers to shine and to, in ways that have kind of changed now, perhaps, the same is also true of experimental film and kind of has been for a long time, which is that the sort of perceived lack of professionalism and the lack of money actually kind of opened wide the space for women to experiment. So, and similar things for non-fiction, newsreels, as you say, documentary, that actually, we talk about, and I will always beat the drum for the fact that women have been underrepresented and women's art is continually rubbished and disrespected and has been historically. So I'm not saying otherwise, but actually experimental film, early cinema and documentary non-fiction are spaces where women's work does, come through.
And what's quite exciting about Maya Deren is that, unlike many, many women in history, to agree with your point, she was recognized by her peers and people who were influenced by her, many men who were influenced by her. So she was very quickly recognized as a major filmmaking presence.
Yeah, she was. And also, I think, a community maker. I really believe so part of her artistic practice was creating the movement of the New York avant-garde around her as a catalyst. So these films, especially Seashell, it's almost been 100 years since it was made. But Meshes as well, they're quite far in the past. And I always think to them as this like phrase by philosopher Lucy Wright, who says, it is important to recognize we already have a history. But what do you think is the source of their power? Why are they still holding this incredible fascination for us? Why do they still work as iconic moments in film history?
Big question.
I think because they're great films. They're just great films.
Easy question.
I think that's all I can say.
Yeah, it's we were just talking after the screening about how incredible it is to see these films on a big screen. It always is, obviously, but you know, many an experimental film has been watched on a like crappy Karagaga rip or, you know, on YouTube, and to actually notice details about a film like Meshes, which I've definitely watched about 100 times, and to notice the texture of the seaweed at the end, and just to shout out the incredible score that was added to Seashell and the Clergyman, which really changed how I see that film as well. So they're incredible films, yes, and also I think they have a mystery to them, certainly the first two, like this mystery that you can never quite, you know, I can sit here and try and explain it, but what's that going to do? Like, it's not, there is a central mystery to them that's kind of incredible and doesn't fade with time, so.
Yeah, and I think, what you're saying about trying to explain their content, I think is very interesting. The idea of Seashell being sort of tied together by too much of a narrative for Artaud, I think it's fascinating, especially because later on the British Board of Censor wrote that the film was so cryptic to be almost meaningless. So I guess they disagreed.
And they added, and if it has a meaning, something like if it has a meaning, it's doubtless objectionable.
They loved it.
Typical BBFC.
Yeah, they loved it.
They loved it. Do you feel that I guess you started to answer this already, but do you feel like it is necessary to try and analyze these films and try to draw meaning from them beyond sort of the fascination they hold for being good film, good visual experiments? Should we try to make a meaning of them? Does that help our enjoyment of the films?
Well, I like looking at how things work. So I don't know if it's necessary in terms of trying to put down some kind of fixed and rigid meaning, but sort of looking at the way they create themes through patterns and repetitions and visual motifs. I think, well, I'm interested in that anyway.
Yeah, and I guess experimental cinema is very concerned with the ways in which cinema works and the rhythm of it. So I think, that's definitely a key into it, for sure.
Yeah, and I am very interested in not just how films work, but how they operate in relation to other communities of people, because I think particularly with experimental film, so much of it is about the people that make it, how they make it, the odds they have to fight against to make it, the spaces in which these films exist, where they're seen, how they're seen. So all of that kind of like messy, bubbly context I find very interesting. And, you know, even though I opened by saying that, you know, Deren doesn't want you to think of Meshes as a surrealist film, I think thinking of Deren's connections to surrealism as a whole is really interesting because of these connections with surrealist artists, because of this artistic environment in New York after the war, sort of during the occupation, where, you know, you have French artists exploring these ideas, and suddenly also kind of women's art, women who are associated with the surrealist movement and painting, having their work or sort of having them become more involved in this art movement as well. So, you know, it's not, something worth commenting on, I think, that when you have the sort of rise of surrealism, you also have the rise for many of women's emancipation. So, you know, the two absolutely coincide. And then it's interesting that for a lot of surrealist artists that, okay, you have this moment of women's emancipation, you have an artistic movement that celebrates women and was very much fighting for women's like liberation and freedom, but then wasn't like representing women's art, and wasn't, you know, the first Surrealist manifesto, there's no women. The first group Surrealist show, there's no women. So like, what's going on here?
Yeah.
Right? And, you know, and how are women portrayed in these artworks and in, not these films, but in in surrealist films, like why are women's bodies sort of fragmented? Why are we seeing women as erotic or muses or kind of these idealized figures? And yet it was a liberatory movement. So what's going on there?
Yeah, and it continues in the 60s and 70s when sort of Hammer is active, and Jonas Mekas creates a filmmakers co-op, and then eventually the Anthology Film Archives, and Maya Deren was helped him beginning it. And then I have this, like, I read this sort of excerpt from a diary of Barbara Hammer, and she was saying, well, okay, Maya Deren got acknowledged, but then I looked at the catalog and there was no other women. So I wrote Jonas Mekas a letter, and she suggested he added Dulac, and he never replied, apparently, never wrote back. Okay, so maybe let's do one last for us and then open it. So I was quite fascinated by we're talking a lot about the idea of surrealism and women artists coming into the movements at this point, being able to make films. How do you feel about the sort of recurring connection of between surrealism and psychoanalysis? Because I think that's an interesting one for women, perhaps.
I mean, I will relate it maybe a bit back to Deren again, but it's sort of interesting again to come back to that point of her sort of wanting to somehow frame these films as not being surrealist, as not dealing with the unconscious, as kind of that somehow being a sort of potentially a feminine trait. And yet you have this very strong ways in which feminist thinking and feminist theory allies and finds spaces in psychoanalysis to give value to the unconscious as a space away from patriarchy, as a kind of space of liberation, of freedom away from the kind of master language. And this is, of course, completely evident in Deren's work. So the statement itself is interesting, but I don't necessarily think it's in the work. And we see, in all three films, a real emphasis on women's consciousness, on women's point of view, going back to this idea as well of the doors that we see in all the films, like,
and the keys.
The doors, the keys. The key is a kind of the door into the subconscious, the emphasis on dream states, a kind of a passageway, ideas of transformation. So these are all ways in which we can think about the overlap between surrealism and psychoanalysis. But yeah, it was, of course, incredibly important for feminist thinking and theory, yeah.
What's interesting, I think, is that psychoanalysis was major in that it opened up this whole new field, which the surrealists loved, because it allowed them, what they were looking for was a way of bypassing the rational, of trying to find a way to connect to the unconscious, to subvert the rational structures which they felt underlied the capitalist order, the established order. So psychoanalysis opened up this whole new area, but that's about it, because then psychoanalysis medicalizes the unconscious, and that's definitely not what the surrealists were interested in. They were interested in plunging into those primal desires that psychoanalysis was trying to channel and perhaps cure. So it's different aims, but definitely psychoanalysis had this huge influence on surrealism in that way, in opening up a whole new field of investigation.
Yeah, it sort of feels like it's inevitable, like having a relationship to psychoanalysis, whether it is as a means to an end at the beginning, a spark in new thought, or sort of trying to oppose it, like women in the 70s were doing, kind of rejecting this idea of lack. So yeah, definitely complex and a long history there. Maybe we can see if anybody has any questions for us.
Thank you so much. First of all, thank you so much for an amazing collection of films. I was speaking to Sophia. I'm so happy to have seen The Hammer. I've seen a lot of Barbara Hammer, but for some reason never seen that film, and I'm not sure how or why. So thank you very much. I am really interested in what you're saying about how both Dulac and Deren were really kind of vociferous about the fact that their films were not seen as, should not be seen as surrealist. And vaguely embarrassed because, I've been teaching them as surrealist films, in class. So might revise that a bit. But I'm wondering if they didn't see their films in that tradition. And I understand what you were saying about, wanting to sort of separate from that kind of idea that surrealism is it's to do with the unconscious, and that's feminine, and they were sort of trying to get away from that. How would they have framed their films? Do we know? Like, how would they have preferred them to be described? Like, is there any record of that?
So for Deren, there's a lot. Yeah, great question. I'm not sure I know the answer, but definitely for Deren, there is a lot of evidence, a lot of writing that frames this work and that frames meshes. And she is, in many ways, like the best person to speak about her own work. But also, I think, I'm always kind of wary a little bit about artists' statements on their own work, because it's a valuable and very important voice, and particularly for marginal cinemas, particularly for women's cinemas. But it's one voice among many. And so there's been some scholarly writing on Deren's relation to surrealism through various networks, and also a kind of argument that though she was positioning herself separate to surrealism, it was also based on perhaps a reductive reading of what surrealism really was about, which is not to downplay Deren's brilliance, but to kind of say that, in fact, perhaps she wasn't actually that deeply engaged in a lot of the discourse around surrealism. Having said that, also she spoke a lot about her films in relation to the subconscious. So it wasn't so much that as perhaps an idea of spontaneity that somehow, and I kind of wonder, like, if you're thinking about a film as spontaneous, does that take away from the fact that it's like a carefully crafted piece of art? And if you're a woman in an environment where you're not seeing many other women, do you feel the need to, remove yourself? Like, this isn't spontaneous. Like, I work really hard. This is a masterpiece. Actually, masterpiece, mistress piece. Do you know what I mean? Like, so I don't know. But I think perhaps there's an anxiety about it being thought of as spontaneous, as kind of random, rather than carefully orchestrated.
If that makes you feel better, I teach them as surrealist films too.
So and so do I.
It's a confessional now.
For Deren, she was most closely associated with what was called impressionist cinema, but to be honest, at that point there is so much. I mean, the surrealists said they hated what they saw as what they called the avant-garde in French cinema, which was impressionist cinema and things like that. So there were all those divisions then, which I think for us are not as clear-cut, to be honest, because all of these people were experimenting with abstract and non-narrative forms of cinema in ways that were more or less aimed at some kind of rebellion, and that's possibly what sets the surrealists apart from all of the other groups at that point. So Dulac was not necessarily a rebel, although, in her own life and career, she was quite an unusual and very strong woman. So that's what she would have associated herself most closely with. But then, she filmed, she made a film from a script written by a surrealist. So this is where, those areas kind of interpenetrate each other.
Thank you. Apologies. This might be a bit more of a practical filmmaking question. I apologise if that's the case. The first film, which I thought was amazing, I was really blown away by the use of things like slow motion and split screen or multiple exposure. How not to diminish it by saying how innovative was it, but how innovative was that? Because I feel like I've not seen stuff done that well in slow motion in a 1928 film before. So I just wanted to know if there was anything you could add to the sort of that aspect of her filmmaking in that film, or in general, please.
Yeah, thanks for the question, because that's something I should have mentioned before. She was a very talented and skillful filmmaker. So those kinds of, that kind of trick photography was associated with Impressionist cinema. You see it in Jean Epstein, for instance, Abel-Gance, all of those people. But she was particularly good at it. So using all of those possibilities of the medium, the dissolve, the slow motion, the superimpositions, all of those techniques, and she was very talented, and she really had this craft as a filmmaker. So it was innovative, although she wasn't the only person doing that, but she was certainly one of the most gifted in that area.
Hi, so obviously not the most smart person in the world, so maybe something I didn't catch, especially in the first film and the second film. But you mentioned before about how their work, it tends to be like quite like homosexual or gay or queerless in a way, or like trying to like kind of like that movement had like a bit of queerness on it, but like at the same time I felt like the first two films, like the relations, not technically the relation between the men and women, they were the power dynamics, they were quite heterosexual in a way. Would this be on purpose, or was more like kind of like a critique, or like does it have a meaning at all, and I just like reading too much between the lines, I guess?
Yeah, thank you. I can answer to the queerness of my film, or I wish it was my film, Hammer's films. So Hammer was very much she identifies as a lesbian, and she was very keen to identify her filmmaking as lesbian filmmaking. So that's why I mention it, and the content of really all of her films is that, and it's aimed at representation and positive representation and joyful representation, if maybe a little bit angry, which is also very important to the topic. I don't know about Dulac and Deren necessarily.
Well, Dulac was actually, she was married, but she was also queer. But that's not really reflecting in this film, and that's probably because it was written by Artaud, I would say.
Fair.
And I think with Meshes, you could do a really brilliant queer against the grain reading of the film, even though I don't see it explicitly personally in that way, but because of the way in which sexuality and sexual desire is represented between the man and the woman. For those that don't know, Alexander Hamid, the co-director, her husband at the time, plays the man at the end, and of course Deren is playing herself. And so there's this very interesting, the way in which the film kind of builds up to this erotic encounter that then becomes deadly and disturbing. So it's a really brilliant, I think, kind of sending up and also, potentially queering of the heterosexual domestic relationship. But there is a potential for a queer reading there for sure. But I don't think we were framing the first two films as queer, but certainly the third one. All for it though. The Hammer film was the third one.
You know, the third one, I definitely felt really weird to me.
Yeah,
but
I know.
The first two, I felt like what you said before was like all of them that were like kind of queer. Yeah. So it wasn't a misunderstanding.
Yeah, no, not at all. But great question, and definitely the way in which sexuality and sexual desire between men and women is portrayed in the first two films is verging on the, certainly repressed and kind of at times very disturbing. So yeah.
Yeah, there is an extreme tension for sure. And I will say the fact that they all play with time does open avenues for readings through queer theory and queer theories of time being nonlinear, for all of them, if one wanted to pursue that reading of them.
Anything final you want to discuss amongst you?
Loads and suddenly nothing.
Yeah, suddenly nothing. yeah, as we were talking about before, just so beautiful to see the films on a big screen. I feel like and seeing it with a theater full of people. I think that's really enriching and special. So thank you for programming them, and thank you to the Garden Cinema, and thank you for everybody coming out tonight and watching them with us. Yeah.